welcome back. We are looking forward to continue. We left off last class, which is on page 216. If you recall, by the end of that paragraph, this Geras HaKodesh has a few paragraphs. As I spoke a few times, that most of the works of the Alter Rebbe in the Sefer Tanya is usually most of the prakim, most of the chapters are one without interruption. Very few in Tanya, in Lukuti Amorim, and the overall Shaykh Hamuni Geras HaTshuva, it's all without any breaks within the Perek itself. And Geras HaKodesh a little more, namely a lengthier Geras HaKodesh. I would even say that arguably that this epistle of the Alter Rebbe has the most, paragraphs, and has the most interruptions of breakdown between, or divides rather, between one idea and the other, distinct than most of the chapters, I would say, even in Geras HaKodesh. In any case, so we're holding on 216. If you recall, we always have the urge, as you probably know by now, to repeat of what we learned in the past. But we sort of battle with ourselves that no, it's not fair, that all the time which is meant to be in the present class was meant to take up with the present information and not of the past, namely because it's a click away to the previous classes, all the previous classes, and this very last class, or the few classes which we had in Geras HaKodesh, I believe this is the fifth or sixth, it's really a click away, and which is wherever you're watching it. The original website, you have the advantage, you have all the previous classes set up. It's just tanyaonline.com. One word, tanyaonline.com, and you have also, it's set up in a way, as we mentioned, again, namely for the newcomers, that it's easy to follow the text. The text is a separate scroll bar, but namely you have all the previous classes, and this is why we can hopefully be able to start from the very beginning, maybe a quick recap, but namely to immediately begin with today's class. Again, it's all up on the left side of the screen, and for that matter, again, as we mentioned, we merited to conclude Lukuti Amorim, Shaykh V'Emunah, and Geras HaTshuva. It's all lined up on the screen, but to understand this very chapter, just really a click away on the previous class. And so today, the Alter begins, and he starts explaining us that when we pay attention to the previous class, we realize how HaKadosh Baruch Hu, from the level of Malch of Chochma of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, all the way to the Brato, to the Hey Tato, which is Mekanada, which nests in Asiya, there's a big gap and a kind of the HaKadosh Baruch Hu to descend to that area of Hey from the Pnimius of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's kind of a quantum leap step. Again, if we learned that the way it is b'nefesh ha'adam, it starts the chokhmah. There's different levels we're talking about the intellectual faculties of the human being, but it's the chokhmah, the bina, the das. The chokhmah is the pnimi, is associated with the deepest part of the nefesh. That's what gives the ability for man to ultimately to talk, even though it goes through the instruments, the five instruments, hey meitzis hapeh, in order to actually utter the words in an organized, in a clear and constructive manner. But nonetheless, the koach hadibur comes from the pnimis hanefesh, which is associated with chokhmah of the person, and then eventually it manifests through actual dibur, through the hey meitzis hapeh, which is the lowest level, the hey even associated with the whole phenomenon of dibur, also klula lesba mishosha, which is every letter really is associated. The uttering of every letter is associated with the hey, which is the breath where the person puts into the word, extends, expresses himself, and eventually it comes across the five instruments, and that allows the word to be pronounced in the way it's meant to be pronounced. But ultimately, the hey that you can't compare the depth of the nefesh to the actual instruments which are external, extremely external, not only in comparison to the inner workings of the nefesh, but how much more so, or even in comparison to the inner workings of the nefesh, the person's feelings, the person's ability to appreciate, to understand. But the Chachma Nefesh, which, as was explained, it's really the Chachma Nefesh is the core Nefesh itself. The gap is so great, the gap is so strong, even though ultimately you need both in order to express a word. And again, I'm saying this with maximum brevity because this is a real recap of what we learned in the past, and you have to really understand it. You have to see what we learned, and again, we had quite a few classes over this, and so the gap is very great, and this is why in the Eilam Esaliyadim, the supreme worlds, what is more manifest, what is more expressed is the Chochmah. In other words, the creation, the emanation of Atzilus, and the creation of Bria, formation of Yetzirah, and so on. They are all involved with the deeper part of Hashem's Dibur, which is the Chochmah of Hashem, and therefore everything in their experience is all sublime, the way they stand with awe and fear, like we say every single day in davening, the Malachim, and much more so the Neshamis. There's an inner adherence and cleave to this sublime, to HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself, which is again to the Chochmah, to the Pnimius of Hashem's Dibur. While Elam Hazeh is about the Hey Tata, the lower, the inferior Hey, not even the Hey Law, which, right, we have in Hashem's holy name. There's the Yud Kei Vav Kei, there's the second Hey, and then the Hey Tata, which is the lower Hey. This world is all about the lower Hey, which is the Chitzenius, the instruments which ultimately bring the words into formation, which is the Hey Maitisapeh. And this is, we can appreciate why the inferiority of Elam Hazeh in comparison to the superiority of all Elam Esaliyadim, particularly Atzilus, and even Bria. We have Ganei Na'elin and Yetzirah, Ganei Natachtin, and so on. These are spiritual worlds, and everything is on a constant appreciation of the reality of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, of course, in different levels, based on what world the Malachim or the Neshamas find themselves, and so on. This is a different idea. We don't have to explain. This world, despite every moment, it is connected, not only connected, its soul vitality comes from HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself. Every day, every moment, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is vitalizing Elam Hazeh. That tells us there's nothing in Elam Hazeh other than the energy of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Nonetheless, there is the opaqueness, the opacity, which is default of Elam Hazeh, the cover-up, the concealment of the divine energy, that it kind of blocks the revelation of the divine energy. There is a concealment which establishes the default in Elam Hazeh, a type of attitude, as the Alter Rebbe writes in famous Perek Lamed Vav in Tanya, that this is a world which covers up, or on the onset, it is a world which not only doesn't demonstrate its own truth, which is Emes Hashem La'elam, but to the contrary, the world which denies on its own, and you have a Yid which has to bring with his Aveda, individually and collectively throughout all the years, to bring the Emes Hashem La'elam, that eventually the world will demonstrate its own true inherent Chayes, vitality, which is HaKadosh Baruch Hu. As we say, V'haya Hashem Melech al Kol Har, it's the land, the world itself would demonstrate and then proclaim Hashem Echad, Shmei Echad, Hashem is one, and His name is one. But by default, it's not so. We don't have to explain. We see it with our own eyes. And this is because this world is associated with a Heitata, like the end of last class, Mekanenes Ba'asiyo, nests in this physical world. So the difference between the Yud and the K, from the Yud of Hashem to all the way to the lowest Hey, which is again a different phenomenon. It's not even low, not only lower, it's a different phenomenon completely. There's of course a big gap and a quantum leap step when the energy has to come from that Pnimius all the way down into that Heitata. So that begins, it says, we want you to appreciate this quantum leap step. We can find it within the human being. The Lamashal is an example. Mishu Chacham Gadol, someone who's a great scholarly, intellectual individual. Lahaskil Niflois Chochma, that his whole occupation, he is a true, deep thinker, a deep intellect, a prodigy, if you will. He intellectualizes with the deep in Niflois is wondrous Chochma, which means in the world of wisdom, he's on a different level. And this person has to mitzamtzim sichlei machshavte ba'is achad midiburi. He has to condense his thinking, his intellect, which by definition, people are thinkers, people are intellectual. It's a wave of intellect. Even the way, for example, someone has to repeat a discovery, an insight. Some things it could take hours, and in the world of intellect, it's just a moment of appreciation of a certain thought, or understanding and perception of a certain thought. It's beyond time, because the whole idea of seichel is about expansion. Machshava is about expansion. What it takes somebody to express this, what the individual thinks for 10 seconds, it could take 2 hours to express, because thought is by definition expansive, beyond time, beyond space, beyond the norm of evolution, the way we see it in this world, starting from the way we have to express it in speech. So seichel, machshava, and this individual has to take this seichel, this intellect, which is again by definition expansive and transcendent of time and transcendent of space, the machshavte in his thoughts, which carry that seichel, and he has to put it into one letter, midibure, of speech. And how could you condense all that into one letter? That seems almost impossible. But if you think about it, that's in the end of the day what Hashem did. I'm just jumping to this, what it points to, which is in the end of the day the nimshal. This world was created only with one letter. Ki b'ko Hashem tzurei lamim. Remember we quoted the pasuk. I'll never quoted the pasuk. B'ko Hashem tzurei lamim. That Hashem created all the worlds. The Olam Haba He created with Yud, and Olam Hazeh with Hey, with one Hey. So imagine someone has to take all that seichel and put it not into elaborative 4-hour drasha, if you will, a 4-hour essay, a 4-hour presentation. Imagine. Even then, the depth, the inner depth, the nuanced depth of the master, of this scholarly individual, this professor, even then, people could walk away with a matter pretty much with accuracy, but they still don't get the inner nuanced workings of this professor. It says that a Talmud, even though he understands, he starts working with his Rav step after step, from the youngest of age or the youngest of stage, but in the end of the day, he's a good, proper Talmud. It took him 40 years to start thinking in the same manner as his master. So ultimately, even the master has a qualitative talent. So he has a talent to qualitatively present this essay or these thoughts or these insights into words. It takes him a long time. It's a longer presentation. Even then, there's certain nuanced energy within that thought, within that insight, that remains with the master, and it's difficult for him to give over. People walk away with something which they understood pretty much completely, but of course you can't expect that the master's seichel should ultimately come to those words, even when you're talking about a 4-hour presentation, as an example, because it's deep, it's profound, and it's associated with a very nuanced nafshistika nitiyot, which means inclinations of the master. He understands with his unique perception, manner of perception. But imagine you have to establish that this master, this professor, is to take all that, what he understood, the entire insight and deep insight, depth and profundity, and put it into one letter. One letter. You have one letter to put all that into. It's just an impossibility. How could that one letter carry all that information? Like I say, even a 4-hour presentation, you get this. At least you start. There's a starting point. People can walk away with something, and even then, they're lacking the very details and the subtlety of this seichel, of this intellectual insight. This insight of this intellectual persona. Because at the end of the day, the Rav, this master, cannot really give everything, even in that extension, an elaborate extension of those 4 hours, but imagine that he has to put it into one word. How can you do that? How can you do that? It seems impossible. But if you think about it, that's exactly what Hashem did. That HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the whole Chochmah of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, in the end, Abba Yosef Brato, it wasn't with many letters that HaKadosh Baruch Hu created this world. it was with one letter HaKadosh Baruch Hu created this world. So this is a yerida, this is a great descent from just like what it exists within a human being. It's a tzimtzum otzum v'yerida g'dela, and if he has to do it, and if he has to put it into one word, it's something which is a great effort for him, because ultimately he has to take something so deep and bring it down and schlep it down into a one letter, not even a full word, into a one letter. It's an enormous nafshis type of effort in order to bring it, to schlep it down, to bring it down when he is on the onset. This individual is on the onset on a sublime high pedestal, intellectual pedestal, and everything about him is seichel. The whole idea to bring it into words is an effort. Even if it's a 4-hour expansive presentation, it's also an effort, because if someone's an intellect and a thinker, you always stand in that sublime state, intellectual sublime state. That's where you are on a constant default basis. And the whole idea to talk it and to present it, it's a whole effort. Someone has to prepare an essay. It's not only becomes this thing, he has to prepare it, because it's not that he's lacking on the information, he's lacking on the transformation, to transform it, to bring it from seichel into dibur, which dibur, speech, is of course inferior by all means, and by the most extreme, from seichel all the way down into dibur, that you can't think of anything too extreme dimensions more than that, because this is the seichel, and this is all the way after the midas, which is machshava, dibur or maisa, or into action, as an example. And in this case, he's talking about dibur because HaKadosh Baruch Hu created the olam is the world with speech. Basar mamoris nivra olam bidvar Hashem shemaim nasu. Hashem spoke creation into being. So you see, you can understand the degradation, the descent of any Baal Seichel, someone who's an intellect, he has to bring this down all the way into speech, even an elaborative speech. How much more so when he has to bring it into one word? It's an enormous establishment. It's enormous effort. It seems some awesome. It's a great degradation to his great and awesome wisdom. We understand it by human beings. But we're talking about Yesim is indicates, of course, infinitely great, because we're talking about something which is infinitely great. We're talking about HaKadosh Baruch Hu as a starting point, but namely the way it is by HaKadosh Baruch Hu's Chochmah. HaKadosh Baruch Hu's Chochmah is not tantamount to the Chochmah of a human being. And when HaKadosh Baruch Hu is from his Chochmah all the way to Yosad Brato, it's a real Yerida, and it's Be'ein Arech, it's Le'ein Kates. But just to the Rebbe gives an example by the way it is by a human being, just to understand a bit, to appreciate the matter, and again, the way we can appreciate it as human beings. But when you're talking to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, of course, it's Le'ein Kates. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu did Tzimtzum Gadol Otzim Barav, which was a great condensement and a great contraction, an intense contraction, an expansive, a grand contraction. When HaKadosh Baruch Hu had to speak creation into being with his words, and utter creation utter the words of creation. In other words, the creation came into being, and more so at the end of the day was with one letter. Even though we have Basar Mamoris Niver Olam, as it says that the entire Parshas Bereshis, the first Parsha, Parsha Bereshis, or the Parsha Bereshis rather, which speaks about creation, these letters are the mere energy of creation, which are Mahava, Machayim, Mekayim, which bring creation into being, into existence, and vitalize creation. This is the energy itself. However, in the end of the day, it is all starts with one letter, that hey, that is the motor, if you will. It's like you have the generator. The generator is the energy of everything that goes on in the town and the city. Every device that goes on is because of that generator. Of course, it is wired into the homes, and it's broken apart, it's minimized, and at the end of the day, every outlet has its power which comes through it, but it's the generator which ultimately establishes the electricity throughout the entire town or city and so on. And the same thing, of course, there's so many letters in the end of the day are involved. For that matter, HaKadosh Baruch Hu created the world with all the 22 letters, but there's the hey, that is because Hashem Tzerulam, and that is the energy to which HaKadosh Baruch Hu created all of creation. Midvar Hashem Shemaim Nasu, on the 6 days of creation. And the breath of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's mouth, all the armies of heaven and armies of earth, as we mentioned many times. For example, you have the sun, the moon, and all the grander creation are called the extremes of all levels of creation. If it's the sun, of the moon, the stars, and so on, and so too the establishment of tzva ha'oretz, the army of this plane, the land which exists, all the multitude and different types of creation within Hashem's world. And this came from the Eis Hei Shel Shem Havaya Baruch Hu. This is all the one letter of Hashem's holy name. Also, Klila, a word which is so, if you think about the Hey, from all the letters, has the least energy, if you will, because every other letter you hear starkly the expression of the letter itself. It's a lamed or a mem or a nun. The Hey really represents the breath which goes into the letter. For that matter, that's why it's the source. The Hey is the source of all the Chaveis ACS, all of 22 alphabet, because it's the Hey, it's that breath which in the end of the day comes into those Moitzei Saped, those 5 instruments which allow these other letters to be pronounced. But you don't hear anything. That's why it's called also Klila. You understand which the Klila means it's kind of empty. It's almost you can't even identify it. That's how little it is in comparison, so to say, even to the other letters of the 22 letters of the alphabets. In the end, it's the source of the 22 other letters of the alphabet. But you could imagine that within all the letters, it's a additional level of yerida, of degradation and descent of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, when he has to come from the level, his level of Chokhmah, it's the infinite Chokhmah of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which represents the Ein Sof. We mentioned many times, which Alter Rebbe writes in Perek Lamed Hey, L'Kutei Amorim, it's a quick away, it's the famous Haggadah, in which the Alter Rebbe writes, Kashashamaiti Mimeri, I heard from my master, the Maggid, that the Echad, that the Chokhmah of Atzilus carries the Echad Emes, the truth of the oneness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Ein Sof, the infinity of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and from that to come and tumble into a Hey, to descend into one Hey, into one Us, to which Hashem has to create the entire world in the 6 days of creation, and on a constant basis, we said, it's the greatest plummet which one could ever think of. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu had to make an effort to do so. Of course he had to make an effort to do so, because it's the greatest tzimtzum, it's the greatest yerida, it's the greatest descent of HaKadosh, from, as we understand and appreciate it even by a human being, that such a great chacham has to bring his words into one letter. And so too, when it comes to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the entire creation was created with his Hey, Behi Bar There's a pasuk which is we brought from the B'Kol Hashem Tzurei Lavim, but it's also the pasuk in Bereshis. The pasuk in Bereshis says Behi Bar when he created, as he created creation. So the Chachamim tell us that the word is broken apart. Behei B'Ram, that you see this all of this creation. And the complexity of creation, and this which we know is so little, even in comparison to what we don't know within creation, with all the development and science and so on, we still just a scratch into the depth which exists inherently, even in Elam Haza. Forget about the Elam Esalyenim, but of course now we're talking about Elam Haza, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to which HaKadosh Baruch Hu created with one Hey, the Hey B'Ram, which is the Mokra Tes Mamoris, which is the source of the other Tes Mamoris, 9 sayings, Shenimshchu Mimaimer Rishon Bereshis, the Naimer Maimer Hu, of the other 9 sayings which evolved from the first saying, right? We have the Asar Mamoris Nivra Elam, which Alter Rebbe is basically saying, which we mentioned before, that of course all 22 letters are involved in creation. Hashem established the 22 letters. In other words, there's the investment of the 22 letters in creation through the Asar Mamoris, the 10 sayings. Now the 10 sayings, of course, referring to the Vayomer Hashem in the Parshas Bereshis, in Genesis, the first Parsha, where Hashem speaks about creation, says Vayomer, Hashem spoke creation into being. Hashem said, let there be light. Hashem said, let there be the sun, the moon, and so on, the stars, and so on and so forth. So each Vayomer is a mimer, and of course you have so many other letters involved in creation. And Hashem did invest with all the 22 letters to establish creation, but nonetheless, it all begins from the Hey. Like we mentioned, there's the generator which gives the energy into the city, but even though in the end of the day it's broken apart with different outlets and different levels and different and different levels of energy, which ultimately has to come in and connect to the actual homes, and the people should appreciate it, be able to plug their devices in. But what is the energy? Of course, it's the generator. And so too, it's that one hay, which is the energy of all the 9 to 10 mamoris. So the first one is the Bereshis, which is known, in other words, if you count in Parshas Bereshis, you only find 9 times the word Vayomer. So where's the 10th? So the Gemara says, Bereshis na memaimerhu. When Hashem said Bereshis, Baruch L'Kimisa Shemayim B'Zaretz, that's also one of the Maimorim. For that matter, that's the first, and that all the 9 ultimately stem, and that's the reason why HaKadosh Baruch Hu established that the Bereshis should not say Vayomer, because it is called Reshis, it's called the original, they could sort of say the primordial energy, which gives the Kayach, that all 9 could come into practice, which is Chochmah, which is called Reshis. So when HaKadosh Baruch Hu has to bring from that Chochmah all the way down, which is apparently, like, it seems to contradict a little, because Mamoris is not Chochmah, the Mamoris is the Dibur. But the Alter Rebbe says, in comparison to all the Mamoris, this is called Chochmah, the Beresh is called Chochmah. That's why HaKadosh Baruch Hu didn't establish this first Maimer with the words Vayomer, which is clearly about Dibur, but rather Bereshis. And Bereshis, we have the word Reshis, Reshis Chochmah, right? Reshis Chochmah Yiras Hashem, and Alter Rebbe many times in Tanya, L'Kutei Torah, he says Reshis Chochmah, pause that Chochmah is associated with Reshis. It's again the primordial expression of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and this is in the word Bereshis. So what Alter Rebbe is basically saying that even in the set of Maimorim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu established this quantum leap step, this quantum leap plummet and descend from Chochmah all the way into the Maimoris. And that's the reason why the Bereshis is not written in a manner by Yomer. But the idea is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu it was, of course, a great effort for HaKadosh Baruch Hu to bring the Chochmah, to establish that the Chochmah should plummet all the way to Dibur, to speech. So what caused HaKadosh Baruch Hu to do so? Why would HaKadosh Baruch Hu take that descend, that plummet down into speech, in other words, from the Chochmah, and to establish that great Tzimtzum in order to come into that one word, which is the Hey Bram, which ultimately manifests in all the Asar Mamoris? So in the beginning, originally, because there wasn't man wasn't yet created in order to have that connection with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Once Adam Arishan came into creation, all the rules changed. Hashem says, my expression is only going to be always reciprocal. That if the Yid arouses himself, or the Adam, the human being, and particularly later, the Yid, through his Aveda and learning Torah and doing mitzvahs, he's established this Reciprocity, this arousal from below. There is going to be this reciprocity from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's the way the establishment, once Adam created, all the rules change. But of course, when HaKadosh Baruch Hu created the world, man was not there to arouse HaKadosh Baruch Hu to come and take this great step in order for the benefit, in other words, to connect with man, which lives in this physical world. There wasn't any, man was not created yet. So what triggered HaKadosh Baruch Hu to make that effort? The answer is the rules were different. As the Alter Rebbe continues, then it was without any arousal of below. There's once man comes into the picture, HaKadosh Baruch Hu creates man. Hashem says everything, any arousal from above, which means you want me, Kaviyachol, to make an effort to come down and to focus on you. You have to make an effort to focus on me. Isurus Lisato, as the famous expression, causes Isurus Leil. Arousal from below causes the arousal from above. But there was no man yet which was created. Man was only created in the 6th day of creation. So what caused HaKadosh Baruch Hu to be that creator? The famous expression of the famous Mekubal, he says, Leiza HaKadosh Baruch Hu Shabbeirah, it's the greatest Yerida, it's the greatest descent for HaKadosh Baruch Hu to be called a Beirei. It's a inferior terminology for HaKadosh Baruch Hu to be called a Beirei, a creator of worlds, to deal with this which is so inferior. And again, in this context, with this example, or this analogy of taking the Chochmah, the depth of the Chocham, and to put it into one word, it's kaviyachol an effort. You could say there's no effort for HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but we know the way it's set up. In the end of the day, that everything which we can appreciate in this world, Mipsari HaKadosh Baruch Hu created the world and created the system. Say the Ishtalshalus, that in the end, that ultimately when HaKadosh Baruch Hu has to intervene, if HaKadosh Baruch Hu has to make a miracle for a person, for example, the Gemara says when HaKadosh Baruch Hu, every miracle HaKadosh Baruch Hu extends to a person, a lot of the points, so to say, if his portfolio comes off, a lot of his merits are taken away because in other words, this which he invested in his portfolio, in his relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, so a lot of points it goes up because HaKadosh Baruch Hu had to make the effort to intervene. That's why HaKadosh Baruch Hu establishes that in Seimchin Alanes you don't rely on miracle. Not that it's difficult for HaKadosh Baruch Hu to make a miracle. The way it's set up, kaviyachol, that's what kaviyachol by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's an effort to make a miracle for the person. There's so HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, do everything naturally. If a miracle has to come in for whatever reason, which most of our, in most of our, as we navigate through lives, we always find HaKadosh Baruch Hu's intervention and avert miracles, but we have to establish that it should be minimal, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu demands it from us because every effort, every intervention of HaKadosh Baruch Hu was kaviyachol, an effort for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So you wanted me to come down to you. Of course, there needed to be schuyas, there needed to be merits. And if you did it too often, so of course many of your merits are taken off your chart, your points are taken off. That's what Gemara says. We have to be very careful to conduct our life in a natural manner. So, and if HaKadosh Baruch Hu had to, and so in the end of the day, it was a great effort for HaKadosh Baruch Hu to come from his level of Chochmah all the way to the Brata, to the Heitata. So you're going to say, man, in the very first day of creation, demonstrated, as the Gemara says, the Medrash says, the Medrash right away understood that he's here to serve L'Avda L'Shamra, to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and it says even the very first day he called together all of creation. He says, come submit ourselves, prostrate ourselves, bow down to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, overtly demonstrate our submission to the Creator of the world. He began his Avodah right away, and that of course aroused the great arousal from above to HaKadosh Baruch Hu to want to connect to Adam. And he did. Of course, then the Chetei Tzadas came in and interfered. But in this case, creation, that effort from HaKadosh Baruch Hu came much before Adam Rishon was created. He was created on the sixth day of creation. So what triggered HaKadosh Baruch Hu to do that, to come down and to make that effort to descend and to plummet, to make that quantum leap step from his Chachma all the way to that one letter? So the Alter Rebbe says it was takabel isurus l'sata klal. Then, because Odik is Adam, ayin lavid is Adam. Like HaKadosh Baruch Hu said in the very beginning when he spoke about the rain and cultivating the earth, he says now it's a bit different. When Adam B'nish will be created, then he'll need to cultivate the earth in order that, and eventually that it would rain and everything would grow properly. But in the very beginning, the Torah itself says in that context, Adam ayin lavid, there's no one to cultivate the earth. So things were a bit different, but in this case also, when you're talking about HaKadosh Baruch Hu's grand decision to take that quantum leap step, is without Isurus L'Sata at all, because there was no man to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu. There's no man to establish that Isurus L'Sata, the arousal below. And that came because Chafetz Chesed, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu was inherently kind, and he desired kindness. It's a famous expression which speaks b'chalal about creation of HaKadosh Baruch Hu creating the world, but with this we can understand, with the depth of the Alter Rebbe's presentation, we can understand where the chesed, why the Chafetz Chesed is so crucial and so essential to establish creation, because you're dealing with something so great has to come down to something so low. Of course, it comes from a desired chesed of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that Hashem is called the Chafetz Chesed, a God which desires kindness. And as it says, "Va'olam chesed yibana," this world was erected with kindness, because the mere idea that HaKadosh Baruch Hu could come down from such a high level, from his chokhmah, which is the nefesh kaviyachol HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Ein Sof HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and come and condense that energy into one letter, that is the greatest kindness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's the point of kindness. Kindness is you're living in your own comfort zone, and then you extend yourself to someone who is not part of that comfort zone, doesn't live a comfortable life. And many times it's far less than that. It becomes a greater difficult. The more the other party needs help, the more you have to go away from your comfort zone. And the more you go away from your comfort zone, is a clear demonstration of your kindness. In other words, if you just have to throw a few dollars into a pushka, also you're going away from your basic comfort zone and you're extending yourself to another party. But when you have to get involved intricately in the other party's life, especially when the person's going through a difficult time, and things are very complex and very complicated, and then you go out and you help them in a full measured manner. Of course, there it's clear you're not just going away from your comfort zone minimally, but you're completely leaving your comfort zone, and what you're accustomed to, and dealing with another party and helping the other party, uplifting the other party. That is a true sign of true kindness. Says the pasuk, Olam Chesed Yibana. This world was created because of the kindness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Could you think of another extension of HaKadosh Baruch Hu coming out of his? This is HaKadosh Baruch Hu coming out of his comfort zone, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu is Ein Sof, and the area of HaKadosh Baruch Hu Yeshiv B'Seiser Eli, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu sits in that area of concealment, meaning to say in a positive, in a virtuous manner, which means he lives within his world, within his cocoon of Ein Sof, if you will, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu is Ein Sof. That's HaKadosh Baruch Hu's comfort zone. Ein Sof is Ein Sof, and the Ein Sof has to come down into one letter, into one hay, based on the analogy of the Alter Rebbe over here. You can't think of a greater chesed than that. And the only reason why HaKadosh Baruch Hu did so, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu is a chafetz chesed. Olam chesed yibana. Again, it gives another beautiful explanation of this pasuk. The world was created with Hashem's chesed. Yes, of course. We understand it on peripherally. It's easy to understand. HaKadosh Baruch Hu created a world with chesed, even though we have to understand a person navigates through Olam. Sometimes the Gemara says, Halavai, a person would not be created, especially a Yid, which the Gemara says, Kol adrachim cheskes sakana, all the ways that have a chazaka of danger, and we know the vulnerabilities and the challenges a Yid has in Elam Hazan to stay put with Hashem's holy Torah and Hashem's holy mitzvahs. That's why the Gemara says that conceptually be rather that a person would not be born, but HaKadosh Baruch Hu had a plan, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu Yid should ultimately make a dira for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Hashem challenged the Yid, and Hashem gave the shlichus to the Yid, of course. In the end of the day, we appreciate creation in the context of our relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, how much nachas we bring to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But in the overall, we see a world, and the world runs in a certain way, and the sun and the moon, and everything which brings comfort, and the botanical world, which brings ultimately food to the person, everything, the way we look out, the way it's expressed in the famous Borchi Nafshi of David HaMelech. Whoa, this is a kind HaKadosh Baruch Hu which created a kind world, or kindly created the Eilam. But if we learn this Alter Rebbe, with the Alter Rebbe's beer over here in the last few pages, we could understand this is the idea of Eilam Chesed Yibana takes it to another level, total another level. That HaKadosh Baruch Hu has to come from his Ein Sof default domain and come down into letters, and not only letters plural, but into one letter. It's the greatest Yidid of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, as he explained it the way even it is by a human being. And why did HaKadosh Baruch Hu come down, leave his comfort zone and come down and mitzamtzim, condense his energy to come into one letter? It's only because HaKadosh Baruch Hu is Eilam Chafetz Chesed and Eilam Chesed Yibana. Based on the pasuk of the world was created with Hashem's chesed, because the mere fact that HaKadosh Baruch Hu could create a world, or would create a world, come down from Chochmah all the way to the Hay, is only because of Hashem's chesed. And there was and that's what the pasuk of Bihi Boram Be'Avram Ki Chesed L'Avram. What Alter Rebbe is adding over here is that even in the words Bihi Boram, you find the idea that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is his inherent kindness which established creation, because there was no man to arouse HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And again, when once man is created, HaKadosh Baruch Hu establishes that this unique relationship with man in general, particularly the Yid, that now it is always going to be this back and forth. So they say this reciprocal relationship. The Yid places an effort for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. HaKadosh Baruch Hu immediately establishes this effort. HaKadosh Baruch Hu makes this effort for the Yid individually or collectively. Am Yisrael make this effort for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. HaKadosh Baruch Hu reciprocates. But in that point, man was not created. So it was all about the chesed of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He says that's where you find also. This is intimated also in the words of Bihi Boram, which we quoted before. Bihi Boram, you have the word Avraham. We know the difference of Avram in the Midas. Avram, the sizes, we know Avram was all about chesed, Avram was all about kindness, and generally between the difference between the Aves, Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Avram is chesed, Yitzchak is gvura, Yaakov is tiferes. But on the surface, we'd have to look we'd have to look into what it says regarding the spheres in their association or their connection with the Aves, Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov. We know Avram was all about chesed. His whole life was chesed. His whole life was leaving his comfort zone and extending himself to another party, to another person, or many people. That was the whole life of Avram, was a life of chesed. So this is what the pasuk says: Bihi bara be'Avraham. You know, I created this world, or the way the world came into being before man was able to step up to the plate because he wasn't created yet. He was only created on the sixth day of creation. Is because Avraham, is because Hashem is a chafetz chesed, ki chesed la Avraham. Kindness is always attributed to Avraham, so the world was created bihi baram with the energy of Avraham, which is the energy of chesed. We'll stop over here, but Alter Rebbe is going to eventually go on and say this is where the idea, at the very beginning of the chapter, the idea of Bachar of Shimon cried when on that pasuk when he said of David, which David Melech, which is quoted in Tanakh by Yas David Shem, as he says, Bachar of Shimon cried, Mam Avid Shema Kadisha, who erects Hashem's holy name every day is the one who gives tzedakah to the poor, because ultimately, after man was created, again, as we said before, the rules change. As Alter Rebbe is going to say, all arousals of above only come from the arousals below. And man has to constantly do chesed, because we're always dependent on HaKadosh Baruch Hu's revitalizing creation, as we mentioned so many times, which is the basis of Shayich Emunah, based on Medrash Tilim and the Baal Shem Tov, and now and elaborated on this Medrash Tilim, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is not only HaKadosh Baruch Hu created, established or brought creation into being the 6 days at the 6 days of creation, but every moment HaKadosh Baruch Hu is revitalizing creation. So the world is always dependent on HaKadosh Baruch Hu making that constant decision to extend himself from on high and connect with that us, with that hey, which would ultimately manifest in all the 22 letters, which would bring creation into being. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu is always doing so. So we always need that decision coming from the kindness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu to go forth with creation. So we also have to always be on call to constantly do chesed on a daily basis. As Reb Shimon says, someone who gives tzedakah every single day to the poor, because it's so vital, it's so essential, it's so crucial, because chas v'shalom, if there's interruption of our chesed, God forbid, how that could compromise HaKadosh Baruch Hu's decision to come and to be that creator, to connect with creation, to connect with that hay, which would give creation today, not only yesterday or the day before, the 6 days of creation, every moment HaKadosh Baruch Hu has to express that chesed in order to come into these ayisiyas, starting from that hay, into these letters, starting from the hay, which with Hashem created the entire world. B'yud kei b'kashem tzuri lam b'hei baram b'hei bram, and that's again, it's ongoing every moment. And therefore, a yid has to understand his responsibility, that to be constantly doing chesed, because at this time, once man came into creation, because Baruch Hu changed again all the rules and regulations, that ultimately every arousal of Mahan High is 100% dependent on arousal of below. So when a yid does chesed, and that's why it's so crucial, a yid could be, even a yid who learns Torah, it says someone whoever says Ein li Torah, if you look Torah Ein li, there has to be always gemilas chasadim in order to allow the world to continue to exist. And again, Bez Hashem will look forward this coming week in this ladder, which is the punchline, which Alter Rebbe is trying to bring home over here to explain the beginning of the chapter of Yas David Shem and how it connects to the statement of Rav Shimon. Have a wonderful evening.